Hello viewers, Sam Stafford here, reporting from home in Ripponden in West Yorkshire. As you may know, if you have listened to episode number 136 of my podcast, there was something of a gap between it and episode number 135. And to help catch up with everything in between, which was a lot, I invited some friends of the podcast, old and new, to discuss some of the policy areas of most interest to them and hopefully to you viewers. 9 conversations were recorded, elements of which form part of episode number 136, but I am publishing them all in full here on the YouTube channel. This is the second of the 9 and is a conversation between Greg Dickson, John Sayer, Rebecca Clutten and Anthony Lee about CPO, land value capture and benchmark land value. Greg is a planning director at Stantec. John is head of regeneration at Ardent and current chair of the Compulsory Purchase Association. Rebecca is a barrister at Francis Taylor Buildings, and Anthony is a senior director and national head of development viability at BNP Paribas. Their conversation takes in the proposed changes to CPO in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, hope value, and the implications of the Grey Belt Golden Rules for land supply. Enjoy.
Hello everyone, lots to get through today, so we'll crack right on. Over the last 6 months or so, there's been a lot of movement in the compulsory purchase, land value capture and benchmark land value space in terms of what the government's been looking at in terms of legislative updates and also guidance in respect to those subjects. Without going through everything in exhaustive detail, we'll get to that in a moment with our expert panel. Just wanted to run through 4 or 5 things that are on my topic list. First and foremost, if you weren't already aware, the government updated the government guidance on CPO, first in October last year and then early this year in February. In fact, I think it was 31st of January, to reflect principally section 189 of the Levelling Up Regeneration Act in respect of hope value and seeking to remove hope value from the assessment of compensation. We might touch upon that in a moment or two. More recently, we've had the CPO consultation from the Law Commission. Rebecca may touch on that shortly, but that's a consultation that's been ongoing now for nearly 3 months and ends at the end of this month on the 31st of March. So take a look at that. If you're interested, I think there's 101 questions, so definitely a question in there for everybody. We've also had the specific CPO consultation, which was live until Valentine's Day. That's now closed, but worthwhile being aware of and looking into. And forthcoming, we've got at the moment the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which will no doubt be a topic during this discussion today. And hopefully in the weeks ahead, there's anticipated to be an inquiry into land value capture, which will happen at some point later in March 2025. So, to kick the ball off this afternoon, in terms of the discussion, just going to revert back to the recent CPO consultation, and the government makes a clear commitment in the consultation to further reforming compulsory purchase compensation rules to improve land assembly, speed up site delivery and deliver housing, infrastructure, amenity and transport benefits in the public interest. So there's a couple of points to unpack there. Number 1 is improve land assembly. Secondly, speed up site delivery. And then you've got the delivery of housing, infrastructure, amenity, interestingly, and transport benefits in the public interest. Rebecca, any thoughts on how that's prevailing or playing out through those matters we've just touched upon? Because there's a lot to unpack there, isn't there?
Absolutely, yeah, there is. And actually, if this podcast had been recorded maybe 2 weeks ago before we'd had the Planning Infrastructure Bill, there might have been a lot more speculation to be had about how they were intending to achieve this. But I think one of the most interesting things from a compulsory purchase perspective, at least, about the Planning and Infrastructure Bill is that, to my mind, it doesn't seem to deliver on that commitment. And I don't, that's not a criticism of the bill. But the tone of the consultation, the impression that one got was that, and from other, kind of messaging that's come out of government, was that they were intent upon materially widening the reforms that were brought forward through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act back in 2023 now. I was going to say last year, but it's not 2023 yet. Absolutely. But they were the impression was that they were intent on expanding the reforms that were brought forward through that act, which provide for directions on certain CPOs to enable the payment only of existing use value or payments associated with extant planning permissions rather than what they term hope value. So things that would have been appropriate alternative development under the 1961 Act. Rather surprisingly, that hasn't actually materialised in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. What we see in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill now is lots of kind of process related amendments, things like provision for electronic service, limited powers for acquiring authorities to modify orders, expedited vesting in very limited circumstances again. So we've seen lots of changes like that. But in terms of that extension of the principle of removing, say, what they term hope value, or the government has termed hope value, that that there's now a relatively limited extension of that power applying only to orders made by parish councils and community councils, or on behalf of parish councils and community councils, which is a CPO that certainly in practice, I would be interested whether anyone else has ever seen one of those promoted, but I certainly haven't. And I can see for those who are listening just to an audio, John's hair is shaking his head, and I don't know, Greg, whether you have either. But so that for me is the most striking thing about the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, is that it seems to have well, for the time being at least, turned its back on that proposal, which may well be in response to the very strong opposition that a number of industry bodies gave to it. So yeah, that I think is the key takeaway from the Planning and Infrastructure Bill for the moment.
John, you've been looking at this closely for the Compulsory Purchase Association and also your own organisation. Anything sort of further to add, apart from shaking your head at the promoters that Rebecca's alluded to?
I mean, I suppose the concept of the quicker, fairer, clearer. I mean, I've been sort of practicing in this area for nearly 20 years, and I think every single sort of government we've had has come up with pretty much the same strap line. It results in a few little tweaks around the edges, and then we move on to a different government and we hear the same story again. So I was quite surprised not to see the changes that Rebecca identifies. We obviously had under the previous government administration the provisions that are now in LURA. My initial sort of reaction to some of this is we probably need to be making use of the powers that we've already got effectively. And there are some other bits and pieces that are sweeping up from other legislation that we haven't seen used yet as well. Actually, it's more about, for me, getting the legislation that we've got in place properly powered up with the relevant sort of people being able to deal with the process and the system to actually help deliver. And I see actually not dissimilar to sort of some of the criticisms about planning and not having enough people to do the work. I think compulsory purchase is probably in a similar situation, and actually being able to run through the process with a decent amount of resource there would probably help speed up just as much as making a few tweaks around the edges.
I think that's right. And actually, one of the interesting things about I forget whose response it was. Maybe it was to the land value capture consultation rather than to the CPO one. But one of the points that was made around changes to land value capture and the introduction of a land tax was actually what you're going to do if you start messing around with big changes to legislation now is actually slow things down, because developers are going to be looking at this going, God, well, what are we paying now? What are we supposed to do? In the context of trying to deliver 1.5 million homes within the next kind of 4 years, any delays at the front end are going to be felt at the back end. You are not going to be able to catch up over the lifetime of the Parliament. So I think you're right, John. It's about using what's there more effectively. There are all sorts of useful powers, like we're going to see conditional confirmation of CPOs, those sorts of things that might be able to speed up at least getting the order in the CPO context. And why not see how they bed in? Why not see how they bed in first, or train people to use those powers more effectively? Certainly, from my perspective, actually the thing that hold up CPOs, apart from the obvious things like funding or planning permission, is anxiety on the parts of under-resourced authorities who don't have the internal expertise to deliver them. Some authorities have never delivered one before, and they think, gosh, well, isn't that all terribly difficult and scary? And actually, it's not.
Yeah, the skills point's key, isn't it? I'd like to get Anthony on benchmark land values and land value capture, if I can get those terms of phrase out. But just before we do sort of turn to that, Anthony, just sorry to keep you on pause for the moment. Is there anything, Rebecca, potentially within the updated guidance, slightly softened, especially in relation to hope value, but also in relation to the guidance regarding promoting a CPO, and that
Yeah,
we reflected upon?
absolutely. I think that's a really important point. To my mind, of all the things that the government have done, one of the most important things in terms of encouraging the use of CPOs is actually the changes to the CPO guidance. Now, they're not radical, but there's a softening of things like of tests around impediments, and a reassurance that maybe you don't have to have planning permission in place at the point at which you make your order, or that you don't have to have sorted out every single impediment by the time you make your order. Those sort of ducks in a row points that for a long time have delayed the making of compulsory purchase orders until a late stage in the process, rather than as a kind of parallel activity alongside gaining planning permission, etc. Because authorities have been anxious about the idea that they might not have those ducks in a row and then get to an inquiry and get shot down. Where I think having made those changes to the guidance, that offers some reassurance to authorities that they're doing the right thing by twin tracking it. And overall, of course, if you're thinking about bringing forward development, what that does is compresses the overall development timeline. You're not waiting, a year, 18 months to get your planning permission and then starting the CPO process. You're getting your planning case together. You might have submitted your application. Maybe you've got the objections to at least see what's going on. And then you're making your order once you kind of know where the lie of the land is. All of that is shaving time off the overall development timeline, which I think is, you've got to think of it as an end-to-end process. And I think that's really, so I think those changes to the guidance have been really helpful in that respect.
Yeah, and I think I've been involved in a recent discussion around Elephant and Castle, which is sort of being heralded as good practice in terms of promoting a CPO and getting all ducks in a row, if you like. Can't say devil in the detail because that'll be omitted from this discussion by the editors. But in terms of where CPOs haven't gone so well over the last 5 years, let's say, without naming specific names, viability has been a key point that's been on the agenda and either has or hasn't been covered particularly well. And trying to link that in, Anthony, to where we've got sort of guidance and drawing this together in terms of how do you get potentially some of the more difficult schemes to be appropriate in terms of viability terms. There's an assumption there that potentially the CPO process at the moment doesn't help that in terms of making schemes more viable, actually making it less. I'm not sure whether that's true. But just referring back, and I didn't even allude to this in my opening, but back in July there was also a consultation on the now published and in place MPPF, but that did say that overall the government still believes that there's merit in providing more guidance on benchmark land values. And just wondered, that's not come through in the current MPPF world that we exist in, but clearly there's a commitment from government to consider benchmark land values, and just wondered whether you had any thoughts on how that's linking to wider discussions on land value capture and back to the origins of this discussion, compulsory purchase.
Yeah, well, there is this sense, I think, in government circles that the planning system is leaving too much on the table in terms of value, and that the guidance on benchmark land value is the key cause of this, and that if only the planning system and can get the right benchmark land value, all of a sudden there'll be far more value to be released for providing further planning obligations, including affordable housing and funding for infrastructure. So there lies the sort of the principle or the idea behind this guidance. But in practice, clearly developers don't overpay for land if they can avoid it. They, like other raw materials for development, land is just raw material for them. Same as bricks and mortar and so on, and labour. They're trying to minimise their costs, not overpay if they can avoid it. But what they're trying to do is to clearly incentivise landowners to release their land for development. And if they're squeezed too hard, the risk is that the land won't come forward. So other difficulties developers are currently facing, one of them is getting hold of the land. And if we're going to deliver the 1.5 million home target over the next 5 years, clearly one of the key factors will be enough sites coming forward, and really far more sites coming forward than are currently in the system. If green belt, grey belt release sites are going to be capped in terms of value, the risk is that the landowners will simply hold on to them, wait for their site to be allocated in a future local plan. So they might wait 5 or 10 years, simply do nothing for their site then to be allocated, and then they can be dealt with the benchmark land value for green belt sites. Clearly, the risk is that you then have a reduction in planning on greenfield sites because those landowners are simply saying, "Well, let's wait." So key risks.
There's an interesting tension there, isn't there? Or is it is it a tension or not? But there's an interesting point there around the government plainly sees the release of grey belt land as a really important part of its delivery of the 1.5 million homes. And then there's been this focus on, well, can we deliver more homes through compulsory purchase and tinkering around with compensation for that? But grey belt schemes are, in my view, schemes that are really unlikely to be brought forward by local planning authorities themselves because the political appetite for them would be minimal at best, except in perhaps the clearest of cases. And that they then are going to still face the problems that the landowners are facing of bringing forward huge amounts of affordable housing that site conditions may or may not be capable of delivering. So it's hard. And then will you say to yourself, well, are those the cases where a Section 14 direction that allows the removal of hope value to be utilised, possibly in the right circumstances? But then if you do use that power, my view, I don't know what others think, is that those are the schemes that are most likely to be subject to serious objection, and you're going to find yourself in drawn out inquiries dealing with the principle of the order and with the Section 14 direction, and then you've slowed the whole thing down again. It doesn't, so why bother doing that in the first place? Which circles back to that first point, doesn't it?
I agree, Rebecca, because it would be a great tool, putting my sort of landowner's hat on for a moment, if you could whip up a storm locally amongst your local community and get their backing for your site not to be compulsory acquired if you want to sort of play the delay and wait game that Anthony alluded to earlier.
Do you see, though, I mean, John, you're involved in cases where you're looking at these factors from a landowner, from an authority perspective, looking at valuations and drawing that together in terms of compensation packages, but also packaging together the CPO. Is that conundrum regarding land value capture, stroke hope value, different things, but all go to the same sort of premise, if you like, one of the key impediments that you find day in, day out, or is that something that's sort of overstated in the press and gets more attention than it deserves?
In my personal experience, it's overstated. There's a lot of different case laws we could quote where these points have been considered with some on the Olympics Park, for example. But more often than not, it's usually not the sort of tipping factor in terms of a key valuation point and something that means that a scheme can't proceed. Quite often it could be something to do with other impacts on the scheme. It could be contamination, infrastructure costs, or quite often it could be, particularly in the compulsory purchase context, it could be the relocation of existing businesses in sort of industrial brownfield sites. That can often be a far greater cost than actually what a sort of some kind of possible redevelopment valuation might be. So, being completely candid, it's not something that I see day to day that means that schemes are falling down.
Yeah, and that's sort of the challenge, isn't it, Anthony? Just thinking about this across the piece in terms of applying benchmark land values across a geography is a big challenge, isn't it? Because I've got schemes on the one hand in one part of a conurbation that may generate some subsidies or some return, but in other parts are already unviable because of the strain that certain planning obligations place upon them. So it's a really delicate balance, isn't it, in trying to come up with a metric.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, as you rightly point out, you can have within an authority different affordable housing levels that are viable. Looking across the country, hugely different residual land values generated by residential development. In some parts of the country, schemes would be unviable if you tried to set a national benchmark land value. So this is one of the key difficulties, really. We're trying to fit a round peg into a square hole here. Benchmark land values are hugely different across the country. Trying to set a national benchmark land value for greenfield land is really, really difficult. And often one needs to look at this through the other end of the telescope. You need to start by saying, well, what does development actually generate in terms of value? As a sense check to any kind of benchmark land value. And very often you'll find that you may be able to eke out a regional benchmark land value at best. But I think in my personal view, it's going to be set by local authority because values are that sensitive. So I think what the government is clearly trying to do is to try and capture more of the land value through the planning system by reducing benchmark land values, particularly on greenbelt release sites. But that will really only work if it's set by local authority. Any kind of national basis would either set the value too high, so many sites would not deliver the objective of maximising value, or be set too low that many authorities would simply find that greenbelt release sites are trying to deliver too much affordable housing and would simply be unviable.
There must be a reason, why, for the most part, policy provides that affordable housing is a matter that's viability tested, because every site circumstance, even within a local planning authority area, is unique. Every site's going to have unique development costs, whether they are just the kind of normal run-of-your-mill development costs, they can still vary in between sites, or whether they're, properly termed as abnormals. That's why those policies around means testing it, viability testing it, have risen up. And it's, there was a comment back in one of the CPO consultations, I think it was the one that finished in February, that talked about the government's view that there may be significant amounts of underused land lying around ripe for development, or that the provision of affordable housing that was offered was being low. It was below the relevant local planning authorities' policies. And I remember thinking about that. Well, if what's being offered is lower than the than the policy requirement, it's probably because they can't afford to pay for the policy requirement. I really, certainly my own experience of advising developers has not been that they're desperate to undercut affordable housing policy. It makes it so much easier. If you've got a policy compliant scheme, you are much more likely to get through, and to get through more quickly. If you're arguing about viability, all that's doing is dragging out your planning process. So, maybe there are some, unscrupulous parties. There must be a very small proportion, though, who are trying to game the system. But the reality is that bringing forward development is risky and expensive and hard, and they're just trying to do their best in a world where we've got rising construction costs, stagnant or falling land values. It's just really tricky. And I think there's a best is the enemy of the good point about all of this, isn't there? Are we trying to deliver perfection, 50% affordable housing across everything, at the expense of actually delivering some affordable housing on more land. But yeah, certainly how I feel about it.
Absolutely right. And obviously, many of these Greenbelt release sites, they will have infrastructure on site to make them connected to local areas. They'll have highways, they'll have public transport contributions and the like. That mean they will have extra pressure on them in comparison to other sites in the local authority area, and that does create difficulties for meeting even the current local plan targets, let alone an increased target. So yes, they're not a panacea for delivery in terms of affordable. They will face the same pressures and probably more pressures than other sites.
Well, plus additional planning risk and
Absolutely.
objection, and yeah. S- So where does it feel like this is taking us in terms of the effects that the proposals that we've seen to date in the last, what was it, so 6 months since this the Labour of Love Part 1 was released? Where do we think they're taking us in terms of seeing more housing delivery?
Yeah, I mean, my sort of reaction to some of this, and looping back to when we talked about the pivot at the beginning, is I almost feel as if the idea of hope value has been sort of talked about for so long by different bodies. I can't believe that this issue's gone away, and we've obviously got the select committee who's looking at value capture, and they've indicated that some of their recommendations might include changes to compulsory purchase. So almost feel as if we it feels as if perhaps there's a bit of a pause on that debate, but it's probably going to reignite a little bit further down the line. So I don't think that's going to go away.
The Law Commission sort of reflects upon 2 points, I think, key. One is the options for streamlining the implementation, John, and the other is, again, further streamlining the compensation process, which, as you've just sort of alluded to, hope value always comes into that equation, and streamlining that, as they have done already in numerous areas, is obviously key. So any reflections on where we might be, as Rebecca's already alluded to, in 6 months' time with those matters? Do you think they're points that are going to continue to come out of further reform, or will the orientation be directed elsewhere?
I think it's the sort of the Law Commission piece is so vast, as you rightly say. There's over 100 questions, and some of them are incredibly techy and incredibly geeky. Some of them that I think are great, but I feel as if some of it is going to be more about finesse rather than some major silver bullet. And I think, almost as Rebecca said at the beginning, the PIB was almost billed as this is a silver bullet, and I'd expect the Law Commission was the sort of the nuts and bolts that sat behind some of that. But I don't think it feels as if it's going to quite pan out in that way.
No, and I think it's worth remembering, what the purpose of the Law Commission reform is. It is about consolidation and rationalisation. It's not actually about major reform, although some of the tweaks, like, one of the suggestions that the Law Commission had made is, well, should we get on and introduce those temporary possession powers that were, we all argued about back in the Neighbourhood Planning Act. And actually, one of the other things that we do see in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill is the effectively exclusion of the DCO regime and the Transform Works Act regime from the Neighbourhood Planning Act temporary possession powers, which is one of the major holdups for for enabling the commencement of those powers, or the full the bringing into force of those powers in a practical sense. So that has kind of foreshadowed that part of the Law Commission's work, but that's, as you say, one tiny thing out of a raft of procedural and rationalisation process kind of reforms, rather than reforms in substance. But that the temporary possession PowerPoint doesn't really go to speeding up housing delivery or delivering more affordable homes. I think that just goes to stopping misuse of notice to treat procedure, etc., and enabling the delivery of larger schemes with temporary possession, minimising interference with land, which is a really good thing, but it doesn't support, the delivery of new homes.
That's the importance of that consultation of the Law Commission, isn't it? That it draws together and it helps to not forget about matters that have been considered previously, even if they were 5, 6, 7 years ago. How do we put them back onto the public or minister's attention for completion now. So I think that, yeah, that's a really good point and powerful, that we shouldn't forget some of the good provisions or provisions that were progressed previously. Just trying to draw this to a close, Anthony, anything that you think may come out of, we've also had previous consultations on land value capture, anything you think as headlines that may come out through if we do have sessions later this month that will be at the forefront of those discussions?
I think the Commission will probably find that the planning system is actually capturing land value in urban areas, certainly already, in terms of the way that BLV is structured in urban areas. There's possibly more to do on greenfield land, but again, it's that balance to be struck between maintaining a sufficient incentive to landlords to release of sites and capturing sufficient planning gain for the public interest. And that's always been a tricky balance to strike.
Yeah, and I think just to sort of round things up, the rate of change is quick at the moment. There is a significant amount of reform already on the table, already happening. There's key dates that you need to be aware of. The 31st of January was a key one that's been picked up by the most recent updates to the guidance. So I think the one thing that I'd say for everybody tuning in today is make sure you continue to watch closely and make sure you're following the updated legislation as and when it takes effect, because that's going to be key, I think, in the months and years ahead, dare I say it. But thank you for tuning in.
Hello, viewers. Sam again. My thanks to Greg, John, Rebecca, and Anthony for letting me share that conversation with you. Look out for the other 8, which I will share on here in due course. They will feature conversations about devolution, strategic planning and local government reorganisation, infrastructure planning, modernising planning committees, development and nature restoration, grey belt, statutory consultees, design and placemaking, and the flood risk sequential test. Please do keep in mind, viewers, that 50 Shades of Planning is by planners and for planners. And so if you would like to use this channel for sharing anything you think that we need to be talking about, then do please feel free to get in touch with me via samstafford@hotmail.com. What have we learnt? Well, town and country planning is very much not a black and white endeavour. There are at least 50 shades in between. Bye for now.